How does the first meeting of the Mont Pelerin Society in 1947 relate to the libertarian movement today? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's Libertarian Angle. The show, as y'all know, that brings you the principled case for liberty, libertarianism, the free society. I'm joined, as I am every week, by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again for another Libertarian Angle.
It's good to see you too, and as always, to be with our viewers and listeners.
Yep, thanks for tuning in. Thanks for your great support of our work. And we couldn't do it without those of you that help us out with donations. And so if you haven't yet made a donation, this is a great time to start. And subscribe to our FFF Daily, which we have striven for, 20 years or so to make the best libertarian commentary page on the internet. We got our monthly journal, Future of Freedom, which raises what I wanted to talk to you about today, Richard. In the newest issue of Future of Freedom, which isn't out yet, but in the one that you sent me the draft for, I found your article very, very fascinating. I find, of course, all your articles fascinating, but this one I found particularly interesting because it deals with something called the Mont Pelerin Society, which was maybe the first international organization devoted to libertarian ideas, classical liberal ideas, and in the midst of this wave of statism that was encompassing the world especially after World War II, certainly before World War II. So I thought that article that you wrote would provide us a nice little springboard to discuss the major issue that you described that went on in that meeting, that an issue that still bedevils the libertarian movement today. So why don't you give us the gist of your article, tell us what it was all about, what the Mont Pelerin Society was, how it came into existence, who the members were, and about that very first meeting that you talked about in your article for Future of Freedom.
Well, this will be published in the May issue of Future of Freedom. And you could call it a review essay, in that there recently was published for the first time the transcripts of the first meeting of the Mont Pelerin Society, which was in April 1947. So this year is the 75th anniversary of the founding of the Mont Pelerin Society under the sort of spiritual leadership and guidance and organizational skill of Friedrich Hayek, who's of course well known as one of the great Austrian economists of the 20th century. As you were alluding to, Jacob, the period between the wars was one that was very disheartening for Friends of Freedom. The growth of totalitarianism, the suppression of increasingly virtually any form of economic liberty through central planning of various sorts, communist, socialist, fascist, the growth of the interventionist welfare state, such as under Franklin Roosevelt with the New Deal years and so on. And there was a deep concern among Friends of Freedom that the cause of liberty, after having shined so brightly in the 19th century in bringing about so many reforms and improvements and abolitions of government restrictions, was now to be reversed by a counter-revolution of various forms and types of collectivism. So in the aftermath of the Second World War, Friedrich Hayek, who had been well known in the 1930s as a critic of socialism, an opponent of the emerging Keynesian economics, had written a book that was published in 1944 called The Road to Serfdom, in which he warned that no matter how well-intentioned many, quote, democratic socialists or progressives might have been in wanting to introduce planning as a means to improve people's lives, to do better than a profit-oriented, greedy capitalism, but who believed that planning could be combined with civil liberties and personal freedom, he basically showed that that was impossible. Once the state controls basically all the means of production and is the central planner and director of everything that is produced, where it's located, how and what people work at, where they'll live, as all part of the comprehensive plan to see that the plan is achieved, personal liberty and individual freedom must go by the board. And therefore, no matter how well-intentioned central planning eventually leads to the dictatorial state, a new serfdom. So having gained this international reputation and come into wider circles than he had even known before the war, with the scattered friends of freedom, both in Europe and the United States, he came up with the idea of organizing a meeting of like-minded people. And so it met for the first time in April 1947 and is still in existence today. If I may say, I'm actually a member of the Mont Pelerin Society. I've been so since the 1990s. And at this first meeting, Hayek basically brought together what, for that time, were the leading voices of concerns, friends who were concerned about the loss of freedom under planning. Hayek himself, Ludwig von Mises, a very young, obviously at that time, Milton Friedman, Henry Hazlitt, Leonard E. Reed, who just a year earlier had founded the Foundation for Economic Education, FEE, the well-known free market German economist who had been living in Switzerland during the war, Wilhelm Röpke. I could go on, Frank Knight, a famous economist who was a market-oriented economist at the University of Chicago. I could go on and on, but some of the leading lights in Europe and the United States of that time. Now, what is impressive about reading through the transcripts is two things here, Jacob. On the one hand, the deep and sincere concern that if the collectivist and planning ideology and policies were to be continued with around the world, the achievements and the great vision of limited government, personal freedom, free markets, impartial rule of law could eventually go by the wayside if trends continued. And it's clear that they sincerely believe that they wish to preserve freedom. The question is, what is their ideal? And as I was reading through these transcripts, I was disappointed. And I bring this out in my review essay. And that is that what did these people want? Was it the old vision of the classical liberal, predominantly laissez-faire liberalism of the 19th century that would be connected with such people, for example, as Frederick Bastiat or Herbert Spencer or other Frenchmen such as Jean-Baptiste Say and so on? No. And that what is very interesting is that what they basically say, for the most of them, and I say the most of them because there were others who were harking back to the vision of laissez-faire liberalism, that what they were looking for is a way to have a middle course, a free market economy in which a wide latitude of competition would occur on supply and demand sides of the market, prices reflecting the desires of consumers, the abilities of producers to bring goods to market would be freely established, so markets would coordinate, balance, inform people about things correctly. But they wanted this to be able to be combined in some way with forms of the interventionist welfare state. They had concluded, and I say this, because you read the transcripts of the presentations, the back and forth during the discussion sessions, how many of them were believed that, well, we have to have control over business because monopolies are a danger. Companies could be too big and government has to, through antitrust type laws, whittle them back to appropriate size. We just can't leave fate and fortune to the marketplace. It is necessary to have certain sort of basic floors of a minimal redistributive welfare state to assure that everyone has a certain needs established. Oh, yes, we don't want it to go too far. We're looking for that sort of balanced middle way. And opposing them, not completely alone, but as you read the debates, his name keeps coming up with it, or his shadow keeps coming up. And that is one of the other attendees, Ludwig von Mises. Mises was well known by all of those participants and in general as a consistent, articulate, and if I can put it this way, certainly uncompromising advocate of something very close to laissez-faire liberalism. The state has functions, but it is to protect people's lives, their liberty, their honestly acquired property, and to assure an impartial rule of law in the securing and protecting of those rights. But beyond that, including education, including no barriers to trade or the movement of people, leaving questions of concern about others who are less well off, primarily, basically, actually all to the charity and philanthropy of market-based, what we now call non-governmental organizations, the voluntary associations of civil society, and that anything beyond this runs the risk of a creeping road to a growth of the state, and the presumption that those in power know better than the individual participants in the market themselves as to what it is they want as consumers, how they can best do things as producers, and to assure that if you are concerned with a monopoly, the strongest weapon against monopoly is to prevent government from giving favors and privileges and subsidies or protections, and to allow trade to be not just national, but international, so that competitive rivals abound around the globe, to assure that competitive forces in the service of the consuming public is always at work, everywhere and all the time. In fact, at places, the other participants basically are borderline rude in saying, one of them says that if we follow Professor Mises's path, we're back to the jungle. What we're looking for is a middle way between the jungle and the prison house. The jungle is unrestrained laissez-faire. The prison house would be Soviet-style collectivism. We want the middle way. You know, a nice forest with a few government-determined paths. That's my metaphor here. But that's basically the imagery of it. Now, the upshot of this is, and in a sense, for Friends of Freedom, this is both disappointing and almost shocking, is that the Friends of Freedom of that time gave away the entire game, at least the large majority of them. You have conceded that the role of the state is to regulate, control, restrict, and guide what and what forms people's lives will take in the marketplace by government determining the size of enterprises, subsidies for certain enterprises, restrictive protectionism for certain enterprises, certain guaranteed redistributed floors where the government will determine this. Milton Friedman proposes in one of the sessions his now famous negative income tax proposal, that below a certain income, the lower you are below that minimum level, the more progressive the government transfer becomes. And when he was asked, well, who would decide the minimum and what the appropriate amount was? Well, that would be determined by the democratic process. And when he was then asked, well, do you view this as pragmatic or something essential to the liberal agenda? Milton Friedman basically says, it's part of a right liberal society for the government to be doing these things. So in a sense, why has interventionism and the redistributive state been so successful in the now 75 years, more than 75 years since the end of the Second World War? It's basically because most of those who truly believed in liberty and the loss of it, in fact, accepted all the premises of their intellectual and ideological opponents. And the few, such as Ludwig von Mises and others who were at that first Mont Pelerin meeting, Henry Hazlitt, Leonard Reed, his two colleagues at the newly formed FEE, Baldy Harper, who later founded the Institute for Humane Studies, Orville Watts, who was a well-known economist at that time, a few American attendees of nonprofits who had helped finance the organization, except those few, basically a handful of American voices, and Mises, who was then living in America. There were no friends of laissez-faire at that first meeting of the Mont Pelerin Society. And though anyone who's read my articles or listened to our many discussions, Jacob, knows how muchly I admire and feel myself to have learned personally from Friedrich Hayek as one of the great economists of the 20th century, he too would fall into the camp of something other than laissez-faire. And so the Friends of Freedom have been at a handicap among supposed friends in their own camp in fighting for the truly free society for all these decades.
Yeah, that's what I found so fascinating about your article, because I always just assumed that that first meeting of the Mont Pelerin Society were all these hardcore purist libertarians. And so it was shocking for me to read what you said, that essentially there was just a handful of them there, Reed and Mises and Hazlitt and maybe a couple of others. But when I first discovered libertarianism, it was because of these little series of books that Leonard Reed had published in the 1950s called Essays on Liberty. And they were hardcore, purist, no compromise essays. I mean, they changed the course of my life, those 4 little books. Leonard Reed, I later wrote an essay that was published in the Freeman, which is what used to be Fees magazine, said, Leonard Reed changed my life. But it was only because they set forth the principled, uncompromising case. It was like all the indoctrination to which I'd been subjected, and especially in public schools, was just shattering. And as it was shattering, I was seeing reality. But it was because of the power of that pure message. Then later, as I was, delving more into the libertarian movement, I realized, my gosh, that really the movement is still dominated. I mean, the movement really reflects to me what was going on at that first Mont Pelerin meeting, that it's dominated by the reform wing, the reform segment of the libertarian movement. And these are people that are not interested in the pure case for liberty. They're interested in reforming the welfare warfare state, which just really befuddles me. Because if you want freedom, you're not going to get it through reform. It's impossible. I mean, reform necessarily implies keeping the welfare warfare state intact, the regulatory state intact, central planning intact, and just reforming it, making it better. Now, that may mean a better set of conditions for those of us on the serfs, but it's not freedom. And the analogy I use is slavery. That, you could have all these reform-minded classical liberals, libertarians, conservative-oriented libertarians, reforming slavery, coming up with slavery reforms like fewer lashings and better work conditions and better health care for the slaves, all of which may have been improving the lives of the slaves, but it wouldn't have been freedom. And so I still don't understand why there's so many libertarians that want to go off in that direction. It's I guess partly what you say is that some of them they're just committed to this way of life. They think they've convinced themselves that that's freedom. They call it the free market oriented path, or whatever. It's like that middle of the road that you're talking about. Or maybe they just consider it too radical to call for real liberty because they think they won't be taken credibly. I remember when I first read Hayek's Constitution of Liberty. I mean, I was a lawyer, and so this book was just profound for me because it was incorporating legal doctrine, constitutional doctrine with economics. And then I got to the later part of the book where he endorsed the welfare state, a minimal welfare state, and I thought, oh my gosh, here's one of my heroes. Why is he going off in this direction? How does he justify this? And of course, it was people like Leonard Reed and Ludwig von Mises and Bastiat that made the moral case why you can't even have a minimal welfare state in terms of morality. If it's wrong to take large quantities of money by force from somebody, which is essentially stealing, it's just as wrong to do so at a minimal level. And then the other thing that I'll relate, and then I'll turn it back to you, was that when we first started FFF, and of course you were with me in those early days, Richard, back in '89 and '90, I wrote an article in our monthly journal, Future Freedom, which was called Freedom Daily, calling for the separation of school and state. And I said that, public schooling is just central planning, which you mentioned is what was part of the debates there at the Mont Pelerin Society meeting. It's a socialist system. And I pointed out that school vouchers are just nothing more than a reform of this central planning system. And so, lo and behold, Friedman goes on the attack in a speech he gave that was later reproduced in Liberty magazine. I'm trying to think of the name of it, but I forget it. But he actually attacks Mises, he attacks Ayn Rand, and he attacks me. It was kind of nice to be in this exalted group, of Rand and Mises about, how dogmatic we were. And he says, Hornberger is saying that, he says, am I a socialist, as Hornberger suggests, because I'm advocating vouchers as a way to get rid of public schooling? So he acknowledged that getting rid of government involvement in education was the legitimate goal. And he said that vouchers were the way to do that. Well, he was absolutely wrong. I mean, vouchers, we've seen vouchers now in Milwaukee for 30 years or so, and they're still there. They actually embed the state more deeply into the school system, into the educational process, because they make private schools dependent on the vouchers. And the private school, once they're on the dole, they're not about to advocate getting off the dole. But what Friedman couldn't recognize is that there was just another alternative, and that is making the case for just repealing compulsory attendance laws, repealing school taxes, getting rid of all the school buildings, and just a total free market in education. And so, but when I see Friedman going off in this direction, I'm thinking, my gosh, no wonder so much of the movement. And the final thing is going off in this direction. Now, the final thing I'd ask you, Richard, is like, what is it that causes some of us, like Mises, Reed, Rand, you and me, and lots of other people, the people who write for us at Future of Freedom and so forth, and the people that support our work, there's some of us that just are attracted to this pure concept of liberty. And Leonard Reed used to call it, addressing the remnant. He says there's a remnant out there of people that really want freedom, and that we're addressing them. What is it that enables us to do this, Richard, as compared to the rest of the movement that are just willing to settle for reform with school vouchers, health savings accounts, regulatory reform, Social Security privatization, reforming the CIA, selective foreign interventionism, all these other reform plans? What is it that causes people to be attracted to the idea of liberty itself instead of reforming the welfare warfare state?
Well, let me sort of approach answering your question with, if I may, just for a moment, quoting from Ludwig von Mises. This is from a paper that he delivered at a conference during World War II here in the United States, around 1942 or 43. And this is what he said: "It is a thankless job indeed to express such radical and subversive opinions, and to incur the hatred of all supporters of the old system, which has amply proved its inadequacy. But it is not the duty of an economist to be fashionable and popular. He has to be right. Those timid souls who fear challenging spurious doctrines and superstitions because they have the support of influential circles will never improve conditions. Let them call us orthodox. It is better to be an intransigent orthodox than an opportunistic time server." Now, let me suggest that what Mises is suggesting here, and remember, this he would have read that in a public address before a crowd of people who were some liberals in our sense, but a lot who were not. So he's basically saying these guys are wrong. Unless they really, this article is about, is it possible to have a pan-European Union? That is like a European Union. He's writing this in the World War II, right? What is the future of Europe going to be? And he said, you cannot hope for peace and prosperity in a community of nations who are cooperating in some type of structural association unless you have free movement of goods, free movement of men, an equality of rights of the same individual sort across all the member nations. You either practice liberty for all people everywhere, or you don't. And it will end up involving conflicts and national controversies and special interest politicking. And you can't try to be halfway. You can't try to be just sort of a halfway reformer. It's better to be an intransigent orthodox, that is, an advocate of laissez-faire, than to be merely a time server who's, I go along to get along. Now, how do you explain that someone comes to that view? It's an interesting question that you're raising. You read those things and let it clicked in you. It did with me. It's just the idea that if something is right, if something really rings true, and in this setting, in the affairs of men, a conception of the rights of the individual, an idea of what is both an ethical and an effective way for human beings to associate and cooperate, and that it is the free market society in which, if government exists, its purpose is to secure those liberties and not to violate them. The type of clicking that I got, and I know that you got at one point too, in reading, for example, Friedrich Bastiat's The Law. What is the purpose of government, and what is the proper way for human beings to associate? And if those things are true, how can you accept anything less, certainly in the set of ideas that you espouse, as the point on the horizon to which you should want to finally reach?
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned Bastiat, because I remember, boy, when I first discovered libertarianism in my late 20s, one of the first books I got was The Law by Bastiat. And I remember just reading it and being shocked by it. I mean, it was like, this guy was just telling the truth. And he was opening my mind up to what the real legitimate role of government is. And I think that's probably the thing that motivates most of us that are attracted to this ideal, is the morality part of this thing, the right and wrong. For example, on the welfare state, we understood the moral principle that it's just wrong to steal, and everybody recognizes that moral principle. It's just that once government gets in the process, everybody's rule of morals is thrown out the window. It's like, oh, well, no, now it's not stealing anymore because it's the government's doing it, and we're going to call it taxes. Well, for us, we saw that the principle of taking money from one person and giving it to another person is just as immoral when the government's doing it as when a person's doing it, when a private thief's doing it. So that was the big thing. But then it was also the workability. You know, I think those of us that hold this pure concept of liberty, we don't have any doubts, Richard, that freedom really works. That take Social Security. I think there's a lot of doubts among people in the libertarian movement who favor Social Security, who want to save it, they want to reform it, they want to privatize it. I think that underlying all of their belief structure is that if you abolish Social Security today, there would really be people dying in the streets tomorrow. And the same with Medicare and Medicaid. If you abolished it today, everybody start dying in the streets. But if you really believe in freedom, if you understand how freedom works, and you understand the morality of it, you don't have any doubts. You know that you could get rid of these programs today, and immediately there would be this outpouring of economic vitality and charity, immediate, spontaneously, within families, within communities that would handle wherever the gap was. A lot of people don't need this assistance anyway, but for those who do need it, we don't have any doubts that freedom really does work. And I think for those two reasons, I think a lot of people just simply can't go that far because they're scared to death that freedom really might not work in the final analysis.
Yeah, there's also part of this is this element of political paternalism, the belief that I or someone knows how others can better live, make wiser choices, can proceed in planning their life, that they know better than these people themselves. Now, what this requires, and what Friends of Freedom usually have, is a high degree of humility. Who am I to tell other people how they should live their lives? For example, you know, I've known you long enough that if I was a paternalist, you have no idea the ways I could find to make sure that you live your life and organize your life better than you do. But I'm such a good libertarian. I have such a degree of humility that I'm not going to force myself upon Jacob Hornberger, even though I could arrange his life better than Hornberger can do it himself. But you know, while I'm trying to be hopefully a little amusing there, humorous, but the fact is, this is the presumption, Jacob, that I have the wisdom, even though I admit I make some mistakes, but I have the wisdom to be a free person. It's the other person over there who isn't wise enough to plan for his retirement. It doesn't have enough knowledge and information to wisely select a healthcare program, or even to think of undertaking a private insurance policy for healthcare, or cannot manage their affairs, or is too weak to resist various short-run temptations that are harmful to themselves and those around them in their family. So someone, and I'm going to delegate these people because they seem to know what they're talking about far better than me about these things. I'm going to delegate through political processes them to have the authority and power, and indeed the obligation to basically run other people's lives. We will give you retirement pensions. We will give you health care. We will assure you and your child an education. We will guarantee you a certain income or a place to live or a job or a certain minimum wage or. Until finally, it becomes an interesting question to talk to such political paternalists and to ask them, are there any corners of human life, great or small, that should not be subject to the government overseeing, controlling, restricting, prohibiting, commanding, or dictating? And when I've talked to some of these people, perhaps not so directly, but in a pleasant conversational way, it's not seem too pushy or rude, the bottom line is they get stumped. Other than maybe the freedom of voluntary actions in the bedroom, there's very little that they do not want the government to control. But even there, they want to have the power to be able to assure that there's a minimum transmission of communicable disease. So not even the privacy of the bedroom, which they usually hail, is totally sacrosanct from their notion of government involvement in people's lives. And that is the greatest problem. I can run my life. It's the other fellow who can't. And that's why we need government to keep them in a narrow corridor of wise decision-making or assistance, which we cannot trust for them to handle themselves or for people to kindly and generously assist them with if required. So we have to have the government to force people to do the right things.
Yeah, it's a great point. And that malady afflicts both conservatives and liberals. The conservatives feel that they need to make people more responsible. You often hear they say, well, we can't have freedom until people are made responsible. Freedom means that people could go out and make irresponsible decisions. And so, no, we have to wait till people are responsible. And liberals, of course, say, oh, well, you could never trust people to do the right thing in terms of charity. That's why we need a welfare state. Well, that's where we're different. We want people to be free even when they make the wrong decision, as long as their conduct's not involving force or fraud. In other words, freedom for us necessarily involves the right to make bad decisions, irresponsible decisions, unhealthy decisions, ingesting harmful drugs or whatever. That if you're not free to make those irresponsible decisions, then you're not free. And that's what distinguishes us from the status in society. So Richard, one of the things that really inspired me about Mises and Reed and Bastiat and the people that were standing fast at that first Mont Pelerin Society was that they stood fast. I mean, those were dark days those guys were writing in, the Keynesian revolution and the whole movement towards socialism and central planning, the welfare state, the warfare state, national security state. They stood in there. And that's what inspired me. And I'm glad they did, because they ultimately changed the course of my life. And that's what we need to do. That regardless of how bad things are, we have to keep standing fast for these principles. And then finally, I just would say that Leonard Reed pointed out that all great movements for liberty have been led by an infinitesimally small minority of people. And that minority of people influences a critical mass that ultimately brings a shift toward liberty. And so there's always a chance, no matter how bad things are today, that things could shift on a dime. So on that note, Richard, we're out of time. Any parting remarks?
Yeah, I would just make one on that. And that is in the Constitution of Liberty somewhere, Hayek says that he talks about an exchange between John Stuart Mill and another well-known 19th century thinker, James Macaulay. And that was that he says, Mill said in his essay on liberty that a people who are not yet ready for freedom can only hope that they have a benevolent dictator to rule over them until they're ready to be free. To which Macaulay replied, that reminds him of the fellow in the old story who said he would not go into the water until he had learned to swim. Unless you learn to swim by going into the water, you'll never have the ability to stay afloat. How can people become self-responsible and reasonably informed on how to make decisions, even when not every decision is a correct one, unless they're given the adult supervision responsibility, unsupervised by the state, to make these decisions themselves and to peacefully and voluntarily cooperate with others.
On that profound note, we'll wrap things up. Thanks for tuning in. And Richard, I greatly enjoyed the conversation as always. Look forward to seeing you next week.